Okay, hello everyone, and welcome Marcus.
Great to be here.
So you heard about Marcus's biography just a moment ago. You are now officially, I think, Europe's youngest unicorn founder. And I think you're really the classic startup story, right? So dropped out of university at 19 to found a company and then made it a success. But I guess it probably didn't feel like that in the beginning. So tell me about that kind of early phase. Did you always know that this was going to be a business that would work? Or was there a sort of a moment of doubt and your family kind of saying you're crazy? And how did that go?
Sure, we definitely had all of that. So when I was 19, I was certain I want to start the company. I was certain it needed to be in the tech industry because I believe that that's where you can have the biggest impact. But of course, having no experience, no funding, really no connections or network, and actually quite limited tech skills, then it wasn't really the best odds of success. So when I was trying to convince my parents to give me the first couple of €1,000 to get going, it took me many weeks to actually convince them to do it. And I think still 6 months in, they were very skeptical that they're going to lose all that big loan that they gave me. But I think now looking back, it was a good investment for them.
So this started really as a kind of a fleet management company, and then you kind of expanded into doing sort of private hire vehicles. I mean, tell me about what was the moment at which you decided what the direction of the company really would be?
Sure. So we have always been taking the customer approach. So we're always looking at it from the point of view of the passenger, that they need to go from point A to B. And how do we make that as fast and reliable and convenient as possible? But we realized in the early days that actually it was very hard for us to offer a great service for riders without actually having cars on the platform. And we realized that the easiest way to get cars on the platform is not just to go directly to drivers, but rather first contact the taxi companies. And still, 5 years ago, they were all using old school dispatching software. So you still had to call them, they were using radios. And our pitch was very simple, that we're bringing them to the digital age. And then on top of that, they were getting some customers from the app. But 5 years ago, they didn't really even care about the app. They were just thinking, how do we replace the radio? So things have really evolved a lot in the last couple of years.
So it was a kind of gradual process, and now everything happens through the app.
Yes, exactly. So we only used to have the taxi companies using the dispatching software for the first couple of years. But eventually they realized that it makes no sense to keep up a call center, and it's a lot more efficient for people just to book from an app directly.
Yeah. So now, Marcus, you've set yourself a huge challenge because you're going up against, one of the biggest tech companies around at the moment, Uber. How are you expecting to compete with them head to head?
So we've been actually in competition all the 5 years that we've operated as a company. So we used to have a lot of competition in Tallinn. A lot of small startups actually started doing a similar platform to ours. And after a couple of years, we managed to build the best one for passengers, and we won. And then, of course, Uber came to most of our markets, and now we've been competing with them for about 4 years. So we've always been used to heavy competition. But what we see is the most important is that if you manage to localize, you manage to build the best product for the customers, then that platform is going to win out, regardless of how much capital the other one has.
So what's the secret sauce of competing? Is it the way you look after the drivers? Is it kind of making sure that you have these negotiations with local regulators? I mean, how do you do it?
So Taxify is now in about 30 countries. So all the way from France to Estonia, to Finland, to Nigeria and South Africa. And each country is very different. So I think the biggest advantage we have is localization. So in some of the markets, for example, we take cash, and we've integrated local carrier billing, so you can pay with your phone bill. In other cases, we've built local safety features, which are really relevant in South Africa, for example. And in some markets, like especially mostly in Europe, it's very critical that you're the best platform for drivers. Because typically, there's very high regulation. It's hard for new drivers to join. And unless you take really good care of them, they make the best earnings with you, and you give them perks and good treatment, they're just going to leave. So really, this localization is key.
Yeah. And looking after drivers, I mean, obviously, the whole gig economy thing has become a big issue of sort of, are these workers, are they self-employed? Where do you stand on that debate?
Well, overall, it's clear that drivers want flexibility. When we look at an average driver we have on the platform, and we have about 500,000 of them, then they work typically about 15 hours a week. So they don't actually want to be classified as employees and therefore have exclusivity, that they would need to only drive with us, and they would have set fixed schedules and so on, but they actually value that they can use multiple platforms and drive whenever they want to. So we're very much supporting that kind of independence.
Okay, so very definitely self-employed, but what kind of perks then do you give them to convince them to stay with you and drive more for you than, say Uber?
So we got to be honest, the main things drivers care about is their earnings. So you can do all kinds of cool stuff around it, but at the end of the day, what they care about is how much they pocket at the end of the month. So that's what we're primarily focused on. But on top of that, we see that there's other ways how we can help them. So giving them fuel discounts, for example, making it easier for them to get the car or get the phone or whatever is needed in that local market. So all around, really making sure the drivers have the best experience with us.
Yeah, but does it really come down, you said it comes down to the earnings in the end, so I think you sort of undercut some of the other, I mean, in terms of the percentage of drivers' earnings that you take, that is consistently lower than most of your competition.
Exactly, so in some cases we even take about half the level that our competition does. And why that's even possible is because from the start we've been a very lean company. We started with just a couple of €1,000 from my parents. We, for the first couple of years, had just a team of 10 to 20 people. So we've always been used to being very lean, being in a high competition state, automating as much as we can. And that has been a very different approach to everybody else in the industry who have been raising billions for years. And now actually when we look at what's the state today, then that benefit of us going through those hard times is actually a big advantage for us. So we're able to undercut them, and there's not much they can actually do about it.
Yeah, so you're charging sort of about 15%, and others would charge about 30%. So
exactly. So that makes a massive difference for the driver. I mean, and at the end of the day, we see the nice thing is that actually, especially in Europe, customers are increasingly valuing that as well. So if they see that the driver makes a good income, you have more drivers on the platform, and they're actually happy, then increasingly more and more consumers are realizing that it makes sense to use that platform and rather not use the one where drivers are increasingly protesting.
Yeah. But okay, so you say you started lean. This was kind of your... But are you going to be able to stay lean? I mean, you've raised a lot of money recently. Is there now not a temptation to kind of go crazy, spend that very quickly? How are you going to keep to your style of management?
So we're overall about 700 people now as a company. So it seems huge compared to what we were even just 2 years ago. But when we actually look at the scale of the business, we're doing about $1 billion worth of rides on the platform. And given that we're doing such big volume, then actually the headcount is quite small. So when we compare to our, let's say, US friends, for example, I mean, they're multiple times bigger in their headcount relative to the business size. So we see we're still able to keep up that lean operation, localize, and at the end of the day, that results in a better platform for drivers and riders as well.
Yeah. And what's it been like with the new investors on board? I mean, you've raised, most famously, Didi Chuxing has invested. Obviously, they're kind of known as the Uber killer because they invest in companies that are going head-to-head with Uber. And by the way, they quite often win. So it's probably a good investor to have in your portfolio.
So far, not a single loss.
Yeah. But I'm just wondering, does it change anything? I mean, do they require you to do things differently? Has that kind of impacted on you on a practical level?
No, actually, from day one, we've been very clear with investors that we actually value the independence. So whether we look at Didi, who invested a few years ago, or now Daimler this year, they're big strategic investors with a strategic goal in mind. But they see that actually the best odds for us to win are if we stay local, we stay independent. And actually, the management team has full freedom in what they do and where they expand to.
So they don't put any pressure on you to do things differently?
Nothing.
Okay.
So it's fully up to us to where do we go and how we operate.
Yeah. And tell me another thing about scaling so fast. I mean, this is a kind of thing that it's a common problem for founders. Nice problem to have if you have a lot of money and you're able to hire people quickly. But how do you manage to scale so fast? And is hiring one of your most crucial problems, that your daily headache, as it were?
Sure, I think that's the same problem for most European companies that start to scale. Just 2 years ago, we were under 100 people. And now, 2 years later, we're 700. So you can imagine it's not that easy to find 600 great people, especially if you're hiring them mainly in Tallinn. I mean, we don't have a massive talent pool there and not many big tech companies before us. So I think it really boils down in most cases, to having a great recruitment team. And in our case, we made a really great focus just to, we decided we're going to focus on recruitment when we were about 30 people. And now we have, I believe, one of the best recruitment teams in Europe.
It's
so
really
we are bringing
small.
in, we have about 5 people in the recruitment team, and we're bringing in 30, 40 new people a month.
Yeah, so these 5 people are working extremely hard. Is there a secret? Because when we were talking backstage just a moment ago, you were saying software developers are still a nightmare to hire. Is there any secret? Where do you find them? Do you have relationships with universities, or what do you do?
I think that you just got to do everything nowadays to get engineers. Not a single company has an easy time hiring them, so you just got to do whatever it takes.
Yeah, and the salaries, are they creeping upwards in terms of what you have to offer people?
Sure, I think with the global world, you have global competition for talent as well. So the salary levels are not very different whether you look at Ukraine, Estonia, or London now. So there's some differences, but it's a lot less than it was 5 years ago.
So tell me a little bit about other plans. I mean, one of the big focuses that you've had is pushing into African cities. And this isn't an area that a lot of European startups have been kind of brave enough to go into. How are you finding that? You're in places like Nairobi and Lagos, which seem quite challenging in terms of understanding the local regulatory environment, and also the traffic.
Sure. So overall, we're already the biggest European ride-hailing platform, and again, we're in 30 countries. We've been doing that for 5 years. We have millions of passengers using us every week. But it's very clear that ride-hailing is not going to be the one solution that's going to solve all transportation problems, because it just doesn't make sense to move a person a couple of kilometers using a 2-ton vehicle. So what we already started doing earlier this year in Africa was to invest in motorcycle taxis. So in most of the cases, the passenger is anyway traveling alone. So instead of us sending a big car to pick them up, we actually see most people would rather prefer a motorcycle, which you can move a lot faster in, it's much more economical, and we saw massive success with that already this year. And that increasingly led us to think that we should try something like that in Europe. So when we finally saw that there's a great vehicle type of electric scooters coming, which we're actually waiting for a long time, then we were one of the first ones to get into that, and actually the first ride-hailing company globally, which even launched scooters on the same platform. So increasingly, you can now get the scooters and cars in European cities from us.
And where are the scooters live now? I know there's a big trial or pilot, or actually it's maybe even running normally in Paris. Where else can we ride these scooters?
Sure. So we started in Paris a couple of months ago. It's going really, really well, even better than what we expected. And now we're just in the final preparations to roll out in other European cities where we operate as well. Unfortunately, as when you look outside, the weather isn't the best. So we're probably going to wait a couple more months before you can see them in most cities.
So maybe in the spring.
Yeah.
So what have you learned from the Paris experience? I mean, are you going to be able to do this better than companies like Bird and Lime who've run into trouble again?
Sure, we're actually very, very confident in our ability to scale this faster than others for a couple of reasons. So one is that overall we already have millions of people who already use us every day to get to wherever they want to go. And having the same app to offer you multiple choices of transport is a lot easier. So we see that about 40% of all our scooter rides are done by our existing ride-hailing customers. So we don't need to waste any funds or resources on acquiring new customers, but we can actually just launch more products to the users we already have. And another big advantage is that we have data from millions of rides. So we actually know where to place the scooters in a more optimal way than anybody else. So increasingly we see that from a customer point of view, it's great to have one app to solve all your transport problems. And of course, we can't forget the cities. So European regulators are very strict on what kind of transportation they allow in cities. And us being the leading European ride-hailing player, we already have been working with them for years. So we see they're actually very much favorable to us to operate the scooter service as well. And we have a good track record of doing whatever the city needs us to do.
But European regulators are very different, and different cities have taken very different approaches to scooters. So, you know, they're not allowed in London. On the other hand, in Paris, people have been, you know, the city authorities have embraced this. So how do you negotiate that? How do you convince a city that the scooters will be a good idea?
Well, the good thing is that we don't need to do it much. Most cities are actually very welcoming to micromobility. They all realize that having more and more cars on the streets is just going to make life worse for everybody. More traffic, more congestion. It's just not going to get people to where they need to go fast enough. So they're very welcoming of bike sharing programs and scooter sharing, as long as it's regulated in a decent way and you don't have them just lying on the streets and they're not safe. So as long as you operate within those frames, they're very welcoming.
So those are the two problems that regulators want you to meet. They don't want to have all these scooters piling up somewhere as becoming kind of problem waste. So that's, exactly. And then secondly is the safety. Exactly.
So mainly on the parking side, there's a lot of things we can do to essentially convince customers what are the best places where to leave a scooter. And on the other hand, safety is a function of many things, but one of those is the vehicles themselves. Another one is making sure everybody actually is above a certain age limit, if that's required, and so on.
Does it actually require quite a lot of policing, though? I mean, just to meet those safety standards, I'm wondering whether that's this kind of expense that companies need to think about. You know, you need to have someone who's verifying, say, age. It's not a trivial thing to do.
Sure. So there's definitely a lot you need to invest in safety to make sure that it works well. But given that we've already been operating with hundreds of thousands of drivers, hundreds of millions of rides, then we're pretty confident we can manage that on the scooter side as well. Mm-hmm. So it's now just a matter of scaling from one city to multiple.
Yeah. So what about London? Are you able to say anything? And I think this is one that you've had your sights on, but it's a very tough negotiation. And Transport for London is taking the issue kind of very seriously and scrutinizing everything to the nth degree. I'm just wondering whether you can give me some insight on how you deal with a regulator that's decided to take such a tough approach. I mean,
sure. So actually, we've seen this in many European cities that have taken a very defensive position on everything related to ride-hailing, setting up more and more rules for the operators. And in some ways, I completely get it, and we're working with all of them to comply. But I think increasingly this is a problem for competition, because the higher are the barriers to entry, the harder it is for new operators to enter the market. And still, in many European cities, there's a monopoly. We all know who it is, and they don't have any competition. So we see that oftentimes regulators, by actually trying to make things better, are actually making it very hard for new competition to come up.
Is that kind of the argument that you use with them, that they really need to be thinking about the competition element and the local champion? That's kind of how you would position yourself, as being the local player.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, we are the local player. So in many ways, we're just trying to explain to them that a lot of the problems that you're trying to regulate would actually be solved if you just allowed more competition to enter. So, for example, when you look at how drivers are treated, if you only have a monopoly in a city, of course, they're going to push their pricing power, and drivers in many of these cities make below minimum wage. Mm-hmm. But you know, how do you actually solve it? Like, are you going to start increasingly regulating the operators, or maybe it would make more sense to allow some competition there? And actually, that would force up the driver income, because actually platforms will start to compete for them. And that's what we've already done in dozens of cities. So it's very easy for us to show that just let us in, and we'll make the city a bit better.
And then, as I understand it, the experience in Africa has been almost the opposite, in the sense that in Europe, you have a lot of regulation, a lot of suspicion about whether these will be safe enough. Whereas when you've gone into Africa, there's often really no regulation in, say, the motorcycle taxi business. That's been a sort of black market, and you've come in to actually try to create some safety regulation around it.
Exactly. So in that sense, you don't have the regulatory problems, but then you have different problems, and especially safety is the main one of those. So what we have done in South Africa is that because the police is so unreliable, you might call them and it takes them 30 minutes or more to show up, then just people are very increasingly worried about safety. So what we need to do is partner with local private security, for example, and use that as an alternative. So this is just one of the examples of what we need to do, or having SOS buttons in the applications for both drivers and riders. So it's a very different market with different problems to solve.
So what do these private security guards do? This is if you have a problem, if you've kind of been
So if you're a
Well-
driver and somebody starts to steal your car, then you can actually press a button and armed security will show up a bit quicker than police would.
Okay. And so that's another benefit for the drivers, I guess, to know that they have this kind of support network.
Exactly. So it's just one of these examples of localization. So you can't expect to solve all problems sitting in Silicon Valley.
Yeah. So what are your future plans? You're now in 60 cities, but you're planning to scale to how many eventually? I mean, what do you have planned for the next few years?
So actually, in terms of countries, we don't plan to add too many. Now we're looking forward in the next 1 or 2 years. We're already in 30, and that might grow to 35 or up to 40. But it's more about getting to more cities. So in the next year, we're planning to open up close to 100 cities. And those are all coming from the countries we're already in. So just in Poland, we plan to take, for example, about 25 cities and so on. So increasingly bringing these mobility solutions to more and more cities that are smaller as well.
And when you go into a city, will you go in with the ride hailing and the scooters as a rule, or will it be very different?
So these are two very different products from many perspectives. Just when you look at the weather, for example, scooters are probably not the best to use in Helsinki 6 months of the year. But ride-hailing, on the other hand, is great all year round. And you need to keep in mind what's the local transportation infrastructure and so on. So overall, ride-hailing we see is a bit more universal, and scooters is more limited.
And what's your kind of vision for how urban transport in the future? Will it really be that we will, car ownership will disappear entirely, in due course?
So that's one of the reasons Daimler invested in us as well. So being one of the leading OEMs in the world, they are very much afraid that in 10 years people will buy a lot less cars than they do now. And they see us already being the leading European player in this future of transportation. They want to be a part of that. But we got to be honest, this is not going to happen very quickly. Autonomous cars are seriously overhyped. And looking at the next couple of years, they're not going to have any massive impact yet. So we just can't wait and believe that those problems are going to be solved in a few years. But we need to find solutions. How do we solve those problems today? And scooters is one of the examples that they're already here. You can literally just start to operate them in a week or two in a city. So we just can't wait 5 years before autonomy gets here.
Well, I think we're out of time. So thank you, Markus, for sharing your kind of future vision, and congratulations on all the fundraising. And we'll look forward to seeing what Taxify gets up to next. Will you have to change the name once you're focusing more on scooters rather than taxis?
So we actually launched scooters under a new brand of Bolt. And increasingly we see that as these are very different businesses, we also need to brand them differently so people would get what are they actually going for.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe a whole bunch of sub-brands then.
So increasingly, as we move from just moving people in cars to covering all sorts of urban mobility, then we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, sounds great. We'll look forward to seeing more. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Corinne, welcome to Slush.
Yeah, it's great to be here. An extremely well-organized event. It's fantastic.
So what is it like being the co-founder of a 26-year-old startup?
Well, it's been a hell of a journey, I can tell you that. And yeah, for any entrepreneurs here, the younger one, it's a story of resilience, I can tell you. It's how to pivot.
Yes, having looked at the story of TomTom, I think the thing that strikes me is that there are 3 sort of key stages to the company's history. There's been the start and the incredible growth.
Yeah.
There's the fact that you disrupted an industry and then you actually got disrupted yourself.
Yeah.
And then how you actually pivoted again. So if you could go back to the start, I think with so many startups in the room, what was it like for you starting out, getting your idea, and then dealing with some incredible growth and success?
Yeah, so we started with 4 people in Amsterdam, 3 Dutch guys and me. And originally we were doing it, so we're back in the early 90s when computers were not so widespread, and we were designing very easy to use software. We were doing that for the utility market in Holland. We then pivoted to B2C software. Some of you might remember, the older one in the audience, products like Scion, Palm Pilot, Compaq iPacs, the predecessors of the smartphone. And we were actually market leader in making applications for those products. And in '95, we started making maps for those products, and we realized that this was outselling any of our products 10 to 1. So we kept thinking there is a better way of doing this, and to cut a long story short, decided to bring an all-in-one navigation, and that's in 2004. By then, we're a company of 24 people. There's no VC who wanted to touch us with a barge pole. I mean, everybody thought navigation was going to come from the car, so nobody was prepared to give us any money, so which was a good thing. You know, it was the old-fashioned days where you had to sell product and make money. So we put everything we had ourselves, the 4 founders, and we launched the first navigation system in 2005, and the thing just took off. Before we knew it, we were selling 1 million products in a year, 1 million products in a month, in a week, and in Black Friday 2008, 1 million products in a day. We democratized navigation, saved a lot of marriages in the process, where people, you know, were navigated from A to B in the car, and yeah, and then arrived 2008.
Well, how did you, before we get to that stage, how did you deal with such scale? Because sometimes people say to me that failure is something that can inspire and lead a company on, but how does a company deal with such rapid success, especially in a bootstrapped hardware company?
Yeah, I think it's, so we went from 40 million to 1.8 billion turnover in 5 years, and from a company of started with 4, about 20 people, to 5,000 people after we acquired Teleatlas. I think that, to be honest, I can't remember. It was crazy, and the key, especially the first few people you hire, you need to make sure when you scale at that level in a technology company, the key was to make sure we organize ourselves for growth and success, and that's very hard. And I'm sure a lot of companies in the room, scaling is tremendously difficult. The key is really not to lose sight of the problem you're solving, so make sure that people who join the company at the management team are sharing in the passion and what you're trying to do, and then try to organize yourself as you're scaling to make sure that you know who's doing what and be efficient. That's very hard.
And how did you maintain the culture? Because one of the things that when I speak to a lot of startups, what they say to me is it's very hard to give up control. Yeah. This idea that you're a close-knit group of people when you start, and then you need to hire, and you need to trust people, and you need to delegate. And a lot of the time, companies, they don't want to give up that control. They how did you trust people to start scaling to the level that you needed to do?
Well, first of all, I think the key, and it's the same for any companies, your management team and your founder team is very important. In our case, there was 4 of us, and we're all very complementary in our skill set. You had one person who was very good had a strong product vision and a good financial background. You had 2 guys who were amazing at designing software and product, very easy to use. So the success of TomTom was in that ease of use. And I wasn't too bad at selling, marketing, and doing pretty much everything else that the guys didn't want to do. No, only joking. So I think so that starts there. And I think it's a fallacy to think that you can grow without losing control. So you need to surround yourself with people you trust, and you need to understand that the only way to grow and scale, I mean, we're now in 50 countries, is really by surrounding yourself with people you can trust to do the job for you, and managing them well. So I think you need to relent a bit of control, but you need to keep the vision. And I think what we always did very successfully is monopolize and get everybody on board with the problems we're trying to solve. And I think sometimes when I hear a lot of startups, I'm a bit worried sometimes where they seem to be more proud about the investors they have on their board than the problem they're trying to solve. And I think the key is really, what is it that you're trying to do with your company? And in our case, we were trying to solve traffic congestion. we were trying to get real-time map making. We were trying, and today we're trying to participate in the urban revolution with the autonomous driving. So following that dream and that passion about the problem you're solving, I think is key. And that's how you attract the right people who share your passion, and then you can trust them because they are as motivated as you are.
And when you scaled, I think looking back, a huge investment for you was the purchase of TeleAtlas.
Yes.
Was that nearly 3 billion
Yeah,
euros?
about 3 billion euros, yeah.
And this took you from being essentially the box maker to owning the mapping software. This was a huge part in how you sort of scaled and, as we'll come on to soon, sort of secured your future. But how did you integrate two firms of such size?
Yeah, I think what's important to understand is the rationale behind the acquisition. As again, we wanted to be completely integrated. We knew that we had a lot of our customers were bringing us map changes. They were telling us where roads were closed or where there were changes. And we wanted to be able to have a real-time map, if you want. So, and we needed that base map to be able to put the changes in it, validate them, and rebroadcast them. Same with our traffic information. So when we acquired TeleAtlas, there was a merging of two companies with very different business culture, but at the same time with a similar goal. And I think the way we could monopolize and get everybody to share that goal that we had was a way to integrate and get the culture together. And I think the culture we now have about 5,000 people, but to keep that entrepreneurial culture has been key for us. We are still and what I mean by entrepreneurial is we take risk. A lot of the things we've done, always people have thought we were mad. When we bought our first navigation system, as I said, people didn't think it would ever work. People thought navigation would come through the car. And when we acquired TeleAtlas, people thought we were crazy. A month later, Nokia decided to acquire the Navtech at the time. So I think the map was a crucial element of a tool that we needed to fulfill our level of ambition. So that's how we managed along the way to keep taking risk, to keep focusing on the innovation. I think that's what kept us where we are today. I'm sure a lot of you see me here and think, well, TomTom, you guys are selling SatNav and Google has eaten your lunch. Well, actually, not quite.
Isn't that also the nightmare that you created this startup, you created this global entity, and then one of the biggest tech companies came in the world and gave away a good enough version of your product for free?
Yeah, that wasn't very good for us. I mean, when you can imagine that's huge amount of disruption. At the same time, there are a lot of problems to be solved. I think there was a lot of consumers who wanted to have a dedicated device, or devices are offline, so you can use them without having a connection. So a lot of customers still like that. But we also diversified our business. We have a telematics company. And today we are really focusing that real-time, high-definition map that is going to be required for autonomous driving.
Well, you sort of, in a way, you started to embrace the competition because, for example, I know that in Apple Maps, you're a huge partner in that, also in Uber.
Yeah.
And so what was it like when you realized that you were at a moment where you were no longer necessarily competing, you were more partnering, that you had to pivot and you had to change dramatically in what you were doing? Was it a difficult thing to do? Was it a logical thing to do? Did you feel like you were a startup all over again?
Yeah, I think we knew that because a lot of it came from a very big, successful technology company that was called Scion at the time, and we knew that this doesn't last forever. We knew that we had to diversify the business. So actually, we had started diversifying. We acquired a company that was making traffic information and telematics before the big disruption in 2008. So we had already diversified the business, but always with our core business of knowing the route and basically getting people from A to B in the safest possible way. I mean, whatever happens, there will always be cars. Whether there's someone in them or not, there'll be cars and they're going to need to go somewhere. And we feel we can play a very important role in that ecosystem. And that's what drives us today, and that's what's been driving us for the last 10 years. So, yes, we have pivoted, and we have that great big level of ambition.
And so is this essentially where you see it, that people still need to get from A to B, and
Yes.
whether it's a car driving them itself, whether it's a person driving them itself, whether it's public transport, people will still need maps, or robots will still need maps to follow. So where is the future that TomTom sort of looks at today when you go all the way back and you look at something such as the box, and then you look at the disruption you caused, the way that you were then disrupted yourself, and then how you look towards the future? Where do you now tend to look at your different roles within the future, for the future of the company?
So we have a huge amount of knowledge on the map making. I think the people who are going to, for autonomous driving, and that's globally, you're going to need to be able to map maps in real time. So it's going to be one of the technologies, and you need to do this in a scalable way, in a global way, at the lowest cost possible. So you need to automate everything. So we've been using actually artificial intelligence for a long time already. We're used of managing and dealing with huge amount of data. We have 700, nearly 1 billion people using our data every day to navigate. We have a huge amount of data, and we can just keep that data current. So the next step is really urban revolution will change. Our cities, the problems is huge. People get killed on the road every day. Our cities are congested. Pollution is immense, and I think there are some big problems to be solved there. And we feel that with the expertise that we have, the way we can deal with that data and that knowledge that we have, we can be a major technology player in this big revolution, urban revolution of tomorrow. And that's super exciting for a company like us. So that's why I'm very optimistic for the future and the way that we've been able to anticipate, adapt, and working on cool technologies today. And that's the way we can attract also the best engineers in the world to keep and work with us on solving that problem.
How did you transform the culture of a company which was essentially a B2C company to what I suppose now is increasingly a B2B company, and to maintain the sort of the same culture, the same spirit? How did you transition that from a people perspective?
I think in any companies, the culture is established by the founders or the people at the top. I think as leaders of an organization, you have a big responsibility towards and you have a big impact on the company culture. And for me, company culture is key. I mean, if you're an entrepreneur, you know it's very hard. There's a lot of rewards because you're in charge of your own destinies. You can take risks and change the world. At the same time, you need to be resilient. So I think that we managed to keep fun in the organization. We have a flat organization where everybody kind of works together towards a big goal. I travel to all our offices around the world, and I see that same entrepreneurial spirit. We encourage our people to innovate every day. So we don't have an innovation officer or an innovation office. We just innovate towards our goal in a daily fashion, and try to use the best technology that we have. So I think we've managed to keep that entrepreneurial spirit. We have fun doing what we're doing. And I must say I have a very loyal team that for a long time we don't have a high level of attrition. And so we get people to join our dream and in solving those problems.
Is it unusual that I believe the same 4 co-founders are all still together,
Yes.
roughly in the same positions 26 years later? And how key was that, and also how difficult is it to keep people who, again, have been there for 26 years when you've had to evolve and pivot the company so much?
Well, I think as leaders, I mean, we were having this launch earlier on where we're discussing the reason why you run companies. And I think it's never money. I mean, we went public in 2005, 12 years ago, and we could have retired. The reason we kept going is because we felt we were on a mission. And I think people in the organization believe that with us, that we're on the mission to make the world a little bit of a better place. And I know it sounds a bit cliche, but we really believe that with the expertise, the experience that we have, we can do that. And I suppose as founders, that's what gets us out of bed every day. And when times are hard and when you get disrupted, the belief that you can make a difference, that you can take the right level of risk, and that you can change things is actually that responsibility, and that passion is very important. And I think for any entrepreneurs with any problem you're trying to solve, and I just wish you to have that same level of eagerness in trying to change things.
If you look at where TomTom was maybe 25 years ago. I'm sure you could never have envisioned the success that came, but then maybe you couldn't have envisioned where the company eventually ended up. But do you now start to have an idea when you look at the future where you want TomTom to be? Do you have a vision sort of 10 years in advance? Or with the size of company, do you still tend to look at getting to milestones? As you say, with the devices, you knew that they were going to exist for a certain period. There was a lifespan to them. Now, do you tend to look a long way forward, or do you tend to look to specific hurdles?
I think you have big mood shoots. I think when you look at autonomous driving, and a lot of companies around here that are working on their parts in making that urban revolution possible, we don't know where it's going to end up. And there are a lot of companies going to arrive in the next, autonomous driving will be around, fully autonomous, 10, 15 years. So I think that's how far we look at. We know that things will change and that we can contribute. And I think that's the way we look at it. So we have milestone, of course.
Yes.
We are our map-making tools and our real-time map-making tools. We have milestone within the organization, but the way to get there is not always straight. So I think you always need to have that light on the horizon of what is the problem you're trying to solve, and that is your role in that revolution.
I think it makes for a lot of very good metaphors, the journey of TomTom. As essentially a company then that is, I said at the start, it's like a 26-year-old startup, given that it keeps restarting and restarting, it pivots and pivots, and that the pivot is often such a fundamental part of any startup's journey. What would you advise for companies as they see success or as they have to change their business models? The things that can sideswipe them in either the early days or, as happened with you at the peak of success, you can get sideswiped and move on. What would your advice be to companies when they have to make that kind of hard decision?
I think as companies, as entrepreneurs, I think you have a very good idea of the problem, what you're trying to do. I think you've got to have that belief in yourself. I mean, entrepreneurs, it's not a job, it's a lifestyle. Huh? So you work day in, day out in trying to get where you want to go. And I think sometimes you tend to get a lot of advice from everyone. I think that's, while advice is welcome, and I think, to get mentoring is good, but never lose sight that you know more about your organization than anyone. You know why you're doing it. So if you keep an eye on the competitive landscape or what's happening, it's important to also follow your gut feel and your intuition. At the same time, you need to be aware that you can get disrupted. So you need to also look broad at your level of competence, the technologies you develop, the IP you're filing. I think it's very important as well to look at the uniqueness of what you do. We file huge amount of IP. That's the other thing when you scale as well. When you get big, you got lots of trolls. If you start doing business in the US especially, you need to make sure you have a good patent portfolio. But I think that's, the key is to really believe in yourself, believe in the problem you're solving, keep at it, and look and book small successes along the way that validate your assumptions as well, to make sure that your customers buy in your product, we get a lot of feedback, of course, from our customer. We're always listening, trying to see how we can make things better. But I think the drive is how can we make things better? I think it's always there in the back of your mind. So you get to one stage and there must be a better way of doing this. There must be a better way of doing this. And then you innovate, you take risk, and you get there. Because
if you don't, essentially, if you don't disrupt yourself, other people will disrupt you.
Yes, that's true. And along the way, we've launched a lot of, before Uber came, we had a similar product. We based a platform for taxis, and Europe is complex sometimes, a lot of regulatory, so we launched this product and we had to pull it out. So sometimes you do things and sometimes it doesn't work, but I think it's good to try and keep trying, and keep taking risk.
Corinne, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We go on.
All right. Well, Cal, I'm excited to talk to you today. So first, I think this question was already asked, but just by show of hands, how many of you use Slack or know about Slack? Maybe I should just ask how many don't, because I think it's everyone. Cal, maybe give folks a sense of what's the latest with Slack. We heard about the fundraise, but just in terms of numbers, kind of where are you?
Sure. We're at about 9 million weekly active users, so people who are using Slack every week to get their work done across about 50,000 companies all around the world. Yeah.
That's pretty impressive. In my experience, there just aren't that many companies that have been able to reach this scale this fast. I mean, 2013 was really not that long ago. And so I'd like to talk to you today about what it takes to build that, from culture to people to products and scaling, and how do you build this kind of rocket ship. But every rocket ship has a founding story, so I think we can start with that. And yours is interesting, to say the least.
Yeah.
It's also not your first rodeo, because you are also co-founder of Flickr. So tell us about how it all began, kind of where you are, and what you've learned.
Yeah, so it's a somewhat similar story to the founding of Flickr as well, in that we didn't start out to make Slack. We weren't super passionate about enterprise collaboration software. We didn't grow up really wanting to make enterprise software. We're really excited about making games, and so we started the company back in 2009 to build a massively multiplayer online game, and we spent 4 years and a lot of money failing to make games. And after 4 years, we realized the game just wasn't working out. Flickr also came from a failed attempt to make a game. And so we realized we definitely don't know how to make games. We're terrible at this. But what can we turn it into? And throughout the building of the game, we'd been split between San Francisco, which was where our engineering office was, and Vancouver in Canada, which was our game studio. We had our artists and animators and sound design and level design were all in Vancouver. And the way that we'd been collaborating, based on using IRC, so Finnish technology, IRC with a bunch of tools bolted on top. So we'd been running our whole business in this messaging platform, and we found the more people paid attention to messaging, the more you wanted to put information in there. So if everyone's eyes are there, we wanted to put in when people bought things in the game, or when in-game events happened, or when a piece of artwork was produced and ready to be animated, or a level was designed and ready to be tested, or a customer had a support issue. We started posting all of these things into messaging. And the more things we posted there, the more people paid attention. So it was this virtuous cycle. And by the end of the 4 years, our business was entirely running on messaging. We had a company-wide mailing list that 4 years in had around 3 emails sent to it. And they were just about benefits, the things we couldn't put on our messaging platform. And we realized that whatever we wanted to do next, because we're kind of done with games, it was a real passion to build games, but we were just fucking terrible at it. We'd demonstrated several times that we can't make games. And so whatever we want to do next, and we had a background in consumer software, so we built Flickr, we realized that whatever we wanted to do next, we wanted to work in the same way. And if we wanted to work in the same way, using messaging at the core of how we collaborated, then maybe other teams like us would too. So maybe other small development teams, people building software, would find a tool like this useful. And what we quickly found was that it wasn't just small development teams, it was small teams of all kinds. So, increasingly, there are an increasing number of knowledge workers, information workers, and all not just across engineering, but whether that's sales or marketing or business operations or media, all of these kind of professions are a team sport. Collaboration is hugely important because nobody really does anything by themselves. And this collaboration piece is key to all kinds of teams at all kinds of companies. And we quickly also realized that we thought early on, small companies, small teams is definitely our audience. We understand how those work. We are a small team ourselves. But I think what we didn't realize was that even the largest company is just made up of a bunch of small teams. A company that has 100,000 employees, it's not that all 100,000 employees talk to each other every day or work on the same project. It's really any large company is made of small teams. And so a tool that helps small, medium-sized teams collaborate can be hugely useful across all kinds of companies.
And you recently launched the product called Enterprise Grid. I think it's a super interesting thing to build for small teams, but also large teams and large enterprises. So where are you in terms of just enterprise traction, and how do you think about building for all of these various consumers and customers?
Yeah, so while definitely our first audience was in small teams at small companies, we see Slack now being used from the smallest kind of 2-3 person family businesses up to the largest like Fortune 100 companies, these huge enterprises. You know, the companies that make other people's enterprise software are all Slack customers today. So we see it being used in one person, or not really one person, 2-person teams, 3-person teams, but also 100,000 person teams. And while there are a lot of kind of different requirements for those larger customers, a lot around administration and audit and compliance and automation, it's really this, inside those large companies, it's still small teams of people who have the same collaboration needs. They need to be able to message, but also, so the key thing that makes Slack different from email, and most companies who adopt Slack previously were using email at the base, maybe some mix on top of that of like some people SMS'd and some people use WhatsApp and some people use Facebook Messenger and this group of people use Skype and the only way to talk to that team was on AOL Instant Messenger. But really email is the like underlying substrate that ties the company together. The big difference between email and Slack kind of on a fundamental level is the idea of channels. So that on email, we're collaborating on something, we send emails back and forth, we come to some decision, and then that, that decision is made, we move on to the next piece of the business. If we do that inside a channel, we have the same interaction, but people around us also get to see how and why that decision was made, the information that went into it, the process, and you get this kind of automatic ambient awareness of how other bits of the business are doing. This is something that we saw when we were building the game, that we might be working on some engineering issue for a new feature, and the customer care team would see that and know that that was coming up, or know we were working on that. Or the animation team might see what was in production on the artwork team in a way that wouldn't have happened over email. And that kind of like group way of working together is hugely valuable for both small teams and really large companies as well.
Do you think email is ever going to go away?
I don't think email is like the cockroach of the internet. Nobody likes it, but it's going to be impossible to kill. And I think it has like the fax machine is still something that people have. And the fax machine was never even very good at anything, and it's still ubiquitous. And I think email will be much harder to kill. So there'll probably be email after the robots take over and kill all of us and take all of our jobs. They will still be sending email. It will be impossible to get rid of. That doesn't mean, I think the problem with eliminating email is that you can't set out to get rid of it, and we didn't. But there are contexts in which email becomes less useful. So now, in 2017, it would be weird to email your friends and family because you use SMS or you use WhatsApp or you use Facebook Messenger. And email has died out in that particular domain. I think and it's because it's not a great tool. When you look at the structure of an email, you have a subject line and a greeting, and then maybe you have to ask about somebody's family, and then you have your actual question, and then you have your sign-off, and then you have a long footer about, like, this is confidential, please don't print this, save the trees. And like, there's that little nugget of information in the middle there, but all this structure around it. And it's not a great format for like talking to your friends and organizing a night out. And it turns out, if you're exchanging hundreds or thousands of messages like a week with the team that you work with constantly, email is not a great container for that. You want that both high bandwidth communication, but also to integrate with the tools you're using for getting your job done. We've moved from this document-centric model of computing in the office, which was around, a Word doc or a spreadsheet, to an increasingly like object in the cloud-centric version of the way we use software. The thing that matters now isn't a file that we're passing back and forth. In many cases, it's this record in Salesforce, or this decision point in your ERP software, or this set of metrics in your marketing automation. And being able to collaborate around that makes a lot of sense.
So speaking of robots killing everyone and communicating over email, how do you think about AI? I know that when you think about larger customers, the issue with getting good signal to noise out of the communication that happens is pretty important. But where does AI fit into how you think about the world, and how do you think about AI?
Yeah, I think the problem, AI as a term is like super loaded with like like generalized artificial intelligence, and you can talk to a robot like it's a human. I think that is like the whole robots killing us and taking away all jobs is at least like 2 years out, right? So in the meantime, I think we're starting to actually see like the ML machine learning side of AI become actually useful. Like the whole deep learning breakthrough that happened a couple of years ago being applied to specific problem domains is starting to bear fruit. So in the way we think about machine learning at Slack is in terms of there's been a lot of research the last couple of years that knowledge workers, information workers, spend a huge percentage of all of their time searching for information, trying to answer a question. And that's usually information that already exists within their company. And a big portion of that is just trying to find the right person to ask a question to. Like, who is it who knows the answer to this question I have that the answer definitely exists? Now, this is not a great use of time for skilled humans. It's not the thing that we really excel at. It's something we're pretty bad at and is ultimately a bit of a waste of our time that gets in between the bit when we do creative, productive work. And so to the extent that we can use machine learning over the data set that your company builds inside Slack to be able to answer questions automatically or route you to the person who can answer something the best, then I think that can be a huge productivity win. And it feels very incremental. It's not like hugely changing the way you work, but I think it can have a big productivity multiplier. If instead of like having to search back through your email and like, I'm pretty sure we had a conversation about this and who was that conversation with, just to be able to ask Slack, on what quarter did we go over $100,000 of revenue? And Slack can just say, here is the answer, somehow using magic.
So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about people, because you can't build a great company without people. And I'll weave in some of the questions from the audience here too. One of the questions is, how did you scale, and what was the team like in the beginning? And I'll complement that with, you guys have a strong work hard and go home culture, which I think is a little different. So how do you think about culture? How do you think about the people, and how do you scale that?
Yeah, I think culture is the aspect of scaling to where we are now that has been both the most difficult and the most important. So there's there's like the technical scaling aspects and figuring out how we deliver software that we sell to very large companies as well as very small. But the most challenges, and I think the place in which we really want to maintain that sense of being a startup has been around culture. It's the way it is usual in the evolution of startups that are successful and become large that people start to feel like, oh, it's not like the old days. We've really lost that sense of what it was like when we were 4 people in the garage and had no money and we were just trying to find product market fit. And I mean, to some extent, you never get those days back because now you get paid and people use your software. It's much easier to build something when nobody is using it at all. But I think the bit that we kind of really want to enshrine as the culture of working at Slack is that, and the thing which has set us apart from other kind of enterprise software, is that we are first and foremost building a product for human beings to use. So we spend a really large amount of time talking to our customers over, through support, through tens of thousands of tweets. Twitter is a very big feedback channel for us, through going out and talking to our largest and our smallest customers, doing user research. And the primary focus of what we're building is to try and make something that feels really good to use. Now, when you think about the phrase enterprise software, to me, that means something I'm forced to use by an IT team that every interaction with it makes me think, fuck, I hate this. I just want to get some piece of work done. This is so badly built. The person who built this clearly hates everybody who is using it. And it's not because the people who build enterprise software are evil. It's because the economics of it is you make a bit of software that you sell to an IT team, not to the people who use it. And the thing that matters is your enterprise compliance, or how it hooks into some other bit of enterprise software, not the experience you get when using something. And I think from both the gaming and consumer background that we come from, and just our focus on building something that we were using is that we spent nearly all of our time thinking about the experience of using this to get a task accomplished. A really good piece of collaboration software will change the way that your team works, but also kind of fades into the background a little bit. It's it's not that we want people using Slack to be constantly thinking, wow, Slack is a really good tool. It's that we never want people to be thinking, fuck, this is getting in the way of what I'm trying to do. And that's often the way people feel about the tools they use. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. How do you think that scales across the world? I mean, you were just in Asia. The Nordics are big for you.
Yeah, I think that Slack, we have users kind of all around the world. And across different languages and different cultures. And I think that regardless of, I think it's somewhat universal across different cultures that knowledge work is inherently collaborative. It is a team sport, and that people need to work together. I think there's been this kind of increasing trend of transparency in the workplace, kind of work-life balance and separation, but also of feeling closer to your team. And I mean, and in the company's interest, feeling closer to the mission of your company. And I think tighter collaboration definitely helps people do that.
Cool. Well, we're pretty close on time. So last question: since you've failed to start 2 gaming companies, what is your favorite game now, and what are you playing?
So I think the big shift since the last failed game company that we made is the shift towards mobile, and I mostly play on mobile now. 2 weeks ago, I was really excited about the new Animal Crossing on mobile, but it's kind of garbage. So I'm not excited about anything this week.
Well, thanks, Skal. I think we're out of time.
Okay. All right. Thanks very much.